in support of advancing strong, sound cybersecurity policy, and we look forward to working with both of you in your respective roles. Last Congress, members of the committee worked together to raise CISA's funding, expand CISA's authorities, and authorize the National Cyber Director. With the support of this committee, CISA worked tirelessly with state and local election officials to ensure the most secure election in history during a global pandemic, no less. But late last year, we learned that the Russian government conducted a sophisticated supply chain attack and gained access to our government and private sector networks. Only months later, Microsoft disclosed that Chinese hackers exploited multiple zero-day vulnerabilities in Microsoft Exchange servers to gain access to emails and maintain persistent access to the networks. A series of high-profile ransomware attacks threatening the fuel and food supply followed. And just yesterday, voters went to the poll to cast their ballots, even as efforts to push the big lie and erode public confidence in democratic institutions persist. These events force three important conversations. How do we activate resources and authorities quickly to modernize federal network security programs? Does the federal approach to securing critical infrastructure, which relies heavily on voluntary frameworks, serve the national security interests of the American people? And how do we protect public confidence in our democratic institutions, particularly our elections? To its credit, the administration has confronted these challenges head on, laid out a bold agenda, and put its money where its mouth is. From the ambitious executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity to the National Security Memorandum on improving cybersecurity for critical infrastructure control systems, to the pipeline security directives, the administration is aggressively leveraging existing authorities to raise the nation's cybersecurity posture. Last week, the White House asked Congress to expand the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to regulate cybersecurity for the water sector. Moving forward, I will be interested to know whether you expect the administration to leverage or seek similar authorities to impose mandatory cyber standards on other sectors, and if so, what you expect the role of your organizations to be in that process. Given my role on both this committee and the January 6th Select Committee, I'm disturbed by how disinformation fosters conspiracy theories, divides us, and makes us doubt our democratic institutions. I'll be interested to understand how CISA's maturing its election security activities related to both the security of election infrastructure and its rumor control efforts. While I appreciate the administration doing what it can by leveraging the authorities it has, this committee is working hard to provide many of the additional authorities necessary for CISA to take on the challenges ahead. For example, bipartisan members of the committee offered amendments to the NDAA that would establish a mandatory cyber incident reporting framework, authorize the Cyber Sentry program, and establish the joint collaboration environment. I'm hopeful that today we can discuss how you will implement these measures when they are enacted into law, as I expect them to be. With that, I look forward to the testimony from the witnesses, and I yield to the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, for hosting this most important hearing today, and welcome to the witnesses, Director Inglis and Director Easterly. I'm pleased to have both of you here, and I'm going to echo the Chairman's sentiments. This isn't partisan at all. This is damn good appointments to really important positions within the cybersecurity realm, and I applaud the administration for doing that. I appreciate you all being here today to provide testimony on your strategic goals and discuss how Congress can work with the administration to secure the cyber threats of tomorrow. We started off 2021 by uncovering the impact of the devastating SolarWinds cyber espionage campaign, but as we all know, the attacks did not stop there. While they may seem distant, the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, Pulse Connect, and other significant ransomware attacks, including the attacks on Colonial Pipeline, Kaseya, and JBS, happened this year alone. As a result, CISA has issued an unprecedented number of emergency directives, alerts, and advisories regarding serious vulnerabilities and cyber threats. Just this week, CISA announced it was issuing a binding operational directive to quickly remediate known vulnerabilities across the federal enterprise, and I applaud that. The volume of alerts, advisories, and directives goes to show the pervasiveness of vulnerabilities affecting owners and operators of critical infrastructure and federal networks. CISA has performed commendable work given the daunting task it has faced over the past 20 years. This, in part, has been due to additional authorities from the fiscal year 21 National Defense Authorization Act. This includes significant authorities such as the ability to issue administrative subpoenas to notify critical infrastructure entities of vulnerable devices, as well as the authority to conduct threat hunting on federal agency networks without advance notice. While new authorities are an important piece, CISA must also be fully funded. I have been a strong proponent of responsible growth at CISA, and I'm pleased the House Committee passed appropriations bill puts the agency on that path. We must also move past bureaucratic turf battles and remember that cyber incidents are rarely sector-specific. We need to continue building on the resources within CISA as a central agency that can quickly connect the dots when a malicious cyber campaign spans multiple sectors. Then share that information across a broader critical infrastructure community. Director Inglis, this is where I expect you to have an important role. Given your role as a principal advisor for cybersecurity, the head coach, as I like to call it, or as the one overseeing the entire federal government's cybersecurity mission, it's important that you're setting the tone that everyone has a role to play and must work together. I look forward to learning more about the various roles and responsibilities of your position, the National Security Council, and the CISA Director. To ensure CISA can successfully carry out its mission needs a higher degree of visibility into cybersecurity threats and incidents impacting private sector networks. Increased collaboration across governments and private industry is essential. And I applaud new initiatives such as CISA's stand-up of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. We also need to ensure the information being shared with the private sector is timely, actionable, and meets the needs of a diverse set of cross-sector stakeholders. To be sure, we need to work on that and get better with that. It's important that there be a high-value proposition for our entities to partner with CISA. It can't be a one-way street. And I'm pleased to have partnered with Chairman Thompson and Subcommittee Chairwoman Clark on mandatory cyber incident reporting legislation, as it will be another important tool for CISA to have to protect the critical infrastructure community. But it won't be a silver bullet. We live in a world of an increasingly interdependent web of hardware, software services, and other connected infrastructure. Single points of failure and layers of systemic importance across this ecosystem leave the potential for cascading impact, which is why I've been focusing on legislation which would require that CISA designate and prioritize risks to key infrastructure sectors as they work to mitigate cyber risks across the various industry sectors and government entities facing threats from nefarious cyber actors every day. As CISA nears its whopping third anniversary in a few weeks, it's incumbent upon Congress to ensure CISA is appropriately prioritizing its mission space and focusing on what it does best within its limited resources to address the most pressing challenges in the evolving threat environment. Between these two highly capable witnesses here today, Director Easterly and Director Inglis, I am confident that our federal government is poised to tackle the growing litany of cyber threats facing our nation. And I want to just note from a personal standpoint before I end, this is the way government's supposed to work. You all are getting along and you're working well together. And I dare say you should stand as an example for other agencies to follow, just like I hope Chairman Thompson and I set an example for others in Congress, which we hope they would follow more than they do. And again, I want to thank you very much for being here today and look forward to hearing the testimony from both of you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members of the committee are reminded that under committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is National Cyber Director Chris Inglis. Director Inglis has over 40 years of government service, including 30 years of service in the Air Force. Director Inglis held senior leadership assignments at the Department of Defense and the National Security Agency throughout his career, including Deputy Director and Senior Civilian Leader. Our second witness is Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Director Jan Easterly. Director Easterly also has a strong record of government service, including 2 tours of the White House during both the Obama and Bush II administration. An Army veteran of 20 years of service, she was responsible for standing up the Army's 1st Cyber Battalion and was instrumental in the design and creation of the United States Cyber Command. Before we begin receiving testimony, I'd like to recognize the impressive military service records of both of our witnesses and thank them for all the veterans for their service in advance of Veterans Day next week. Thank you for your participation here today. I look forward to your testimony. Without objections, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I'll now ask each witness to summarize their statement for 5 minutes or do the best you can, beginning with Director Inglis.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Ketko, distinguished members of the committee and staff, thank you for the privilege to appear before you today and the honor to appear alongside Director Easterly. I'm eager to update you on the Biden-Harris administration's progress in standing up the new office of the National Cyber Director and to discuss the administration's approach to cybersecurity. The President's commitment to cybersecurity as a matter of national security and as an issue of concern to all Americans is evidenced by the positions he created, the appointments he made, as well as by the speed with which the administration continues to modernize defenses and bolster our security. I am, of course, appearing before you today as the inaugural National Cyber Director, a position this Congress created in January, confirmed for me in June after nomination by President Biden. I am grateful for the confidence that the President and the Congress have placed in this role, for the opportunity to bring it to life, and for the cybersecurity and critical infrastructure resilience investments you're endeavoring to make in the proposed Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and elsewhere. I remain committed to engaging with you as we take on these critical and shared imperatives. To that end, I'm pleased to tell you that the new office is making progress as a full-fledged leader in these imperatives. On Thursday, October 28th, we publicly released the National Cyber Director's first strategic intent statement, which outlines the strategic approach and the scope of the work that I intend the office to undertake. At the same time, we announced the designation of Chris DeRocha as the Deputy National Cyber Director for Federal Cybersecurity, a dual-headed title that he will hold along with his current role as the Federal Chief Information Security Officer. We will create unity of effort and unity of purpose in our shared mission to ensure the security of federal networks. Both of these announcements lay the groundwork for the office's approach, but are certainly not the sum total of our intended endeavors. We continue to build out the National Cyber Director team, and equally important, relationships with key partners inside and outside of the federal government, and we'll follow up in the very near future with a more concrete, comprehensive description of our priorities and the strategic objectives that will guide our work for the years to come. The Office of the National Cyber Director is, of course, currently constrained by the lack of an appropriated budget, and we continue to work with Congress to secure the resources we need to bring on key staff. Beyond the constraint this places on our ability to hire key staff members, make necessary procurement and acquisitions, and find permanent office space for our future, the lack of appropriations inhibits our ability to plan and delays our ability to quickly and fully make the expected contributions of the National Cyber Director. That limitation notwithstanding, I am pleased to inform the committee that we have built a robust pipeline of talent, and once appropriations are available, expect to reach a total of 25 personnel on board by the end of December and a full complement sometime later in fiscal year 2022. As I have testified previously to the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, the National Cyber Director looks to 4 key outcomes as its benchmark of success. Given the foundations that these priorities establish for accountability of the National Cyber Director, I will comment briefly on them here. First, the office will drive coherence across the federal enterprise, ensuring that we build, operate, and defend digital infrastructure under control of the federal government and support the private sector with unity of purpose, effort, and messaging. Second, we will zero in on improving private-public collaboration, supporting and building on the work of CISA and others. Third, in close collaboration with the Office of Management and Budget, We will ensure that the U.S. government is aligning its resources to its aspirations and accounting for the execution of cyber resources entrusted to its care. Finally, the office will work to increase present and future resilience, not only within the federal government, but across the American digital ecosystem, in technology, the skills of our people, and in roles and responsibilities. This is, of course, a big task, which we have initiated by exercising incident response and planning processes, and we will continue to evolve these processes so that they are future-proofed for tomorrow. None of this work occurs in a vacuum, and much of the credit for progress in developing these themes and in the work of putting them into practice must go to my partners on the National Security Council, my colleagues sitting alongside me, Director Easterly, and many others serving in the federal cyber ecosystem. The challenges we face are daunting, and overcoming them will require realizing a digital ecosystem that's resilient by design and robustly defended, a policy and commercial environment that aligns actions to consequences, and ensuring that public and private sectors proactively and decisively collaborate. Although the Office of the National Cyber Director is a young and still small office, we have made significant progress and are building robust relationships with our interagency partners. When funding is in place and with the continued leadership and support of this Congress, the ONCD will be in a strong position to lead in enhancing the security and resilience of our nation's cyber ecosystem. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Director Easterly.
Great, thank you. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, members of the committee, thanks very much for the opportunity to testify today. I am really thrilled to be here as your partner in protecting the American people from cybersecurity threats. We know that cybersecurity is a team sport, so I'm also honored to testify beside our nation's first cyber director, my teammate and friend, Chris Inglis. I want to start by also thanking this committee for your steadfast support in ensuring that CISA has the resources and authorities needed to carry out the critical and substantial mission of the agency. As you know, CISA serves both as the operational lead for federal cybersecurity and as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure security and resilience. Our goal is to lead the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to the cyber and physical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day. And the mission is challenging to execute, and the stakes couldn't be higher if we fail. Our mission can only be accomplished through strong collaborative partnerships, and collaboration is built into our DNA at CISA. Partnerships are our strength, our ability to share information broadly about threats and vulnerabilities to enable early warning and prevent other victims from getting attacked. This is what I consider one of CISA's most important superpowers, our authorities to share information broadly with a variety of key stakeholders. Now, as we evolve our approach to cybersecurity, my goal as director is to fundamentally shift the paradigm from public-private partnership into public-private operational collaboration, and from information sharing into information enabling, timely, relevant, and most importantly, actionable data that network defenders can use to increase the security and resilience of their networks. Powering this shift is the new Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC, built off the concept of the Joint Cyber Planning Office, authorized and resourced by Congress. The JCDC is driving two key changes. First, it's the only federal cyber entity that by statute is required to bring together the capabilities across the federal government, state and local partners, and our nation's critical infrastructure owners and operators. We're working closely with the largest cloud providers, internet providers, cybersecurity companies, and federal partners like FBI, NSA, and the National Cyber Director to take collective action against urgent cyber risks. Second, it's the first effort to focus on creating, exercising, and executing cyber defense plans that proactively address risk before an incident occurs. This effort is a major step forward, leveraging unique capabilities of government and the private sector to drive risk reduction at scale. And we're already yielding positive results. We're validating and sharing information across broad swaths of partners in multiple sectors and producing measurable mission impact. Last month, we utilized JCDC partner information with FBI and NSA to develop and issue joint guidance against black matter ransomware that critical infrastructure entities are actively using to protect themselves. And going forward, we're going to focus on defining a robust planning agenda and producing plans to address ransomware risks and threats to cloud infrastructure. We're also taking urgent steps to reduce national cybersecurity risk. This morning, we issued a new binding operational directive that fundamentally changes how the federal civilian government addresses vulnerabilities being actively exploited by our adversaries. Under this directive, federal agencies must now fix vulnerabilities identified by CISA within specified timeframes and update their security programs to effectively account for these requirements. This directive will significantly improve the federal government's vulnerability management practices and degrade our adversaries' ability to exploit known vulnerability. And while the BOD only covers federal civilian agencies, we strongly recommend that every network defender review the known vulnerabilities posted publicly at CISA.gov and prioritize urgent remediation. And I was gratified to see significant support for this directive to include from this committee. I also consider our partnership with Congress, and specifically this committee, as absolutely essential to CISA's mission success. Last year's NDAA included significant new authorities for CISA, to include the administrative subpoena. We've issued over 30 of these that have directly resulted in mitigation of numerous vulnerable devices. We're also positioning CISA to conduct persistent hunt across federal civilian networks through deployment of endpoint detection and response tools. Another factor critical is our people, and I want to make CISA the place where the nation's best cyber defenders and security professionals want to work. We are making positive strides on this front. Just last week, we announced that Washington Secretary of State Kim Wyman will be joining CISA to lead our election security efforts, and I'm thrilled about welcoming her to the team at the end of this month. I'm also pleased to finally leverage the cyber talent management system later this month. CTMS will help CISA cut time to hire, reduce bias, and ensure that we're assessing the right skills while enhancing workforce diversity. There are a number of areas where we must continue strengthening CISA, and I'm grateful for the committee's work to advance key legislative priorities, including cyber incident reporting, new state and local government cybersecurity grant opportunities, and codifying key CISA ICS authorities like the Cyber Sentry program. You have my commitment to continue working together as partners to advance these and other crucial legislative priorities. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. I look forward to your questions.
I thank the witnesses for their testimony. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses. I'll now recognize myself for questions. And this is a question to both of you. The recent surge of high-profile cyber attacks from Colonial Pipeline to JBS has called into question the federal government's voluntary framework for securing critical infrastructure. Certainly, the security directives issued by TSA earlier this year marks a significant shift in the federal government's approach. And just last week, as I indicated in my opening statement, the administration urges Congress to give EPA more authority over cyber standards for water. With that in mind, do you envision the administration moving to impose security standards on additional critical infrastructure sectors? If so, and I guess, do you envision that, yes or no?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the question. It's an important question. I would say that the answer to the question is yes. I think the context matters greatly. This must be done in partnership and collaboration with the private sector, in so much as we work together to determine what the shape, the form, the function is of digital infrastructure to ensure that innovation, capacity, generation continues to take place in the private sector. We allow market forces and the leadership of the private sector to take their proper role, and then by exception, when necessary, impose the further non-discretionary standards that are required. We've done that in other industries like the aviation safety industry or the automobile industry, and I think that this is an equally appropriate place to do that for the critical services that our nation depends on.
Well, thank you. So you said yes, and then you went on to define the role. So thank you very much. Director Easterly.
Thank you for the question, Chairman. I would agree with everything that National Cyber Director Inglis said. I would add 2 points. As we know, 85% of critical infrastructure is in private hands. And so this really is based on a voluntary regime, as you pointed out. We know that collaboration and trust is absolutely critical to the model of how CISA works with the private sector. And so we're going to continue to build that trust and build that collaboration. Notwithstanding whatever regulations may come into place, we are going to focus on the collaboration piece. I would add, though, in order to support any regulation that may come into force, we are doing a lot of work on articulating what are the cybersecurity baseline standards and goals. At the end of September, we released those goals specific to industrial control systems, and we're working on other goals that were tasked out by a White House National Security Memorandum. So we are, at least at a minimum, letting all of our critical infrastructure sectors know what is expected to ensure the security and resilience of their infrastructure.
Well, thank you very much. I think, Director Inglis, you kind of addressed this question, but in your opening statements, do you have the necessary authorities and resources to do your job?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that question. I believe that I have sufficient authorities and resources, given the appropriations that we expect in the very near term, to make the difference that's expected. We will, based upon experience, come back and determine whether or not they need to be refined in some way, shape, or form. But for the moment, I believe I have the authorities and expected resources to make the difference expected.
Director Easterly?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to this committee, because you've done a lot to give us authorities and resources. But we appreciate what's in potential upcoming legislation to include cyber incident reporting, a recognition of grant programs for our state and local partners, the codification of Cyber Sentry and our role in ICS. To the resource question, we've gotten a lot of resources, and I think it's great to get resources specifically for cyber defenders and infrastructure defenders. I would say, though, what is also very important to us are those mission enablers that will help us execute the resources and the funding that we're getting. Human resources, our people, our chief human capital officer, our finance, our acquisition authorities. So we're going to need to bolster those mission enablers to enable us to actually execute everything that you've given us.
Thank you. So if I hear you correctly, with that, you're going to still have to find some bodies, right, to carry that mission forward.
Say that again, Chairman.
I think you're going to have some people or bodies to carry the missions forth.
Absolutely.
And as a committee, we've heard quite often that somehow we don't have enough qualified individuals to staff our agency. Do you find the lack of staffing a potential problem for CISA?
We are working hard to build out our capability and capacity. We have a lot of vacancies that we're working very hard to fill. Two of the things that I'm trying to do to deal with this, first of all, to really do an analysis of how we can accelerate our hiring, all of the steps that are required. How do we actually create some efficiencies on that? Because having just come from 4.5 years in the private sector, I think it takes way too long to be able to bring people into the federal government. And I think that's incredibly important to be able to streamline that process, sir. The second thing that we're doing is really leaning into cyber talent management system authorities, which come into force the 15th of November, that will give us greater flexibility to be able to hire based on aptitude and attitude, not based on degrees or certifications, and it will allow us to be able to pay closer to market. So that flexibility, I think, will really help us close the gap to enable us to bring on the talent that will make us the agency that the nation deserves.
Thank you. Yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Inglis, a quick question for you. It's pretty clear that the authorities that CISA has and the cyber director have are pretty well laid out, and I understand the interaction between you two. One of the ones I kind of struggle with is what is the role of the National Security Council within the cyber realm, and if there are some issues that we need to work on there, what are they?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a question we're asked on a fairly frequent basis, and one that I think deserves a solid, crisp answer. I would say that as we look at it, I believe I'm speaking for both Jen and myself, there actually is the need for a National Security Council leadership role in cyber for the following reasons. Typically, in any domain of interest, cyber being one of those, we should consider bringing all instruments of power to bear. Our intelligence assets, our diplomats, our financial abilities, our legal remedies, and typically bringing those instruments to bear in a coordinated fashion to achieve the appropriate desired conditions in the domain of interest, cyber being one of them. It's traditionally the role of the National Security Council. We believe that that remains appropriate in this space, and therefore our colleague, Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology, Ann Neuberger, we think appropriately and fully fills that role as a complement to what Jen and I then do within the realm of cyberspace.
Okay. I'll leave it at that. Director Easterly, I mentioned in my opening statement, I've mentioned it several times before, we're getting to the point now where we're going to start having more requirements in the private sector. And we also ask them many times to get us more information. And I think the more information they get on their cyber attacks, the better you can understand the playing field. And the better you can understand the playing field, the better you can help them going forward. A common refrain you heard from the private sector is a lot of stuff goes to CISA, and this is before your time, mind you. A lot of information goes to CISA, not a lot of operational information comes back. How are you doing trying to fix that issue, and what do you plan to do going forward?
Thanks for the question, Ranking Member Katko. So it's been about 110 days. I think we're doing pretty good, but it's just a start.
You don't have everything fixed in 110 days?
I know, I failed miserably. You know, I have a great appreciation for those comments because I spent the past 4.5 years in the private sector, and sometimes my observations were that the government seemed disjointed, not coherent, and a black hole. And so, frankly, I think we're doing a lot under Director Inglis's leadership and the leadership across the federal government to really ensure a coherent approach, that we are speaking with a coherent voice to the private sector. And frankly, it's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC, because by statute, it's the only cyber entity that brings together CISA and NSA and FBI and DOD and DOJ and ODNI and the Secret Service and the National Cyber Director. And so that is a place where the private sector can come and expect accountability in one place and can go and say, we've given you this information, what are we getting back? So that real-time conversation is happening, and I will tell you we are already leveraging those partnerships from cloud security providers, from cybersecurity companies, to take that information, to enrich what the federal government has, and then to get that back, both to those companies, but importantly to critical infrastructure owners and operators, and the state and local. As I said in my statement, we are looking to do not just sharing, but truly enabling, because if we can't get information to network defenders in a timely way that allows them to use that information and that it's relevant and actionable, there's really no point in sharing information. So we are looking to change that paradigm, and I am very focused on ensuring that we are giving feedback and enriching what we get from the private sector.
Okay, thank you very much. Following up on the critical infrastructure, I appreciated our discussion last week at CSIS on the importance of CISA having the capability to identify the most critical of critical infrastructure. Because as you know, if everything's critical infrastructure, then nothing is, right? So while we may disagree on the best acronym for the effort, I think you said Pisces is a new one. Mr. Chairman, we got to learn now, another one. It is clear that we are seeking the same outcome here, right? And it's paramount that we are understanding the single points of failure and layers of systemic importance across this ecosystem that have the potential for a cascading impact of compromise. So can you briefly discuss with me the importance and current state of play with CISA's systemically important critical infrastructure effort?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I do think it's incredibly important that we are able to articulate that infrastructure that is absolutely critical to Americans' way of life. And we look at the lifeline sectors, water, transportation, communications, energy. We look at all of the 16 infrastructure sectors, but we also analyze them, sir, through the lens of national critical functions. Because as we know, in today's society, everything is connected, everything is interdependent, and therefore everything is potentially vulnerable as it rides on that technology backbone. And so, inspired by some of the good work that came out of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, the Systemically Important Critical Infrastructure, SICI, we've done some work on what we're calling Pisces, which does sound like a better acronym. The primary systemically important entities, again, those that are have economic centrality, network centrality, and have logical dominance in those national critical functions. So we think it'll end up to be about 150 to 200 entities that we really focus in on to be able to provide information. It goes back to the benefits and burdens question, but I absolutely think that we need to codify this. So to your point, sir, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So I'm a big proponent of the effort.
Thank you very much. And before you go back, I just want to note, it's very important that you continue your collaborative relationship. I think the way you have things set up is you should be very proud. And like I said, you're a symbol for other agencies to follow. And instead of having turf battles, you're getting things done, and that's important. And also know that with the chairman and myself, don't wait for hearings. If you need something, just pick up the phone and call us, okay? All right, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this hearing today, and thank you and the ranking member for your bipartisan collaboration on cyber and many other issues. I could not be more pleased to have the two witnesses we have before us today, two outstanding appointments, and take great pride in seeing the nation's first national cyber director before us after more than a decade of trying to establish that position. I'm glad it's finally established and that Director Inglis is the first inaugural director. 5 minutes is going to go by fast, so I'm going to get right into my questions, but deeply appreciate the leadership you are both providing in protecting the nation in cyberspace. Director Inglis, I'll start with you. In your testimony, you mentioned that we can expect the Office of the National Cyber Director to, quote, issue more routine, explicit statements of priorities and guidance on a year-to-year basis to support departments and agencies in their own planning and operational prioritization, unquote. I commend you for initiating this work. These year-to-year statements of priorities and guidance will address gaps in our medium-term planning that translate our cyber strategy into day-to-day work carried out by agencies. Incidentally, this kind of activity is exactly what Congress intended for the National Cyber Director. So on the subject of your office's roles and responsibilities, you testified before the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee about a possible executive order in development that would delineate processes for your office, including around setting these yearly cyber priorities. Can you update the committee on any plans to issue such an order?
Yes, Congressman Langevin, thank you very much for the question. I think that the statute has gone a long way, and the policies that we have described have gone a further distance in describing what the roles and responsibilities are of the various players in this space. An executive order, we believe, is the essential kind of capstone to that, to crisp up, at least for the moment, based upon the experience and the expectations we have, where we should then take this further. We are in discussion within the White House about when and how to effect an executive order that would bring additional clarity to these roles and responsibilities. I'm confident that we'll work our way through in weeks to months' time to deliver such a thing.
Very good, thank you. And I too also want to commend you and thank you for your work on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. It's a privilege to serve with you on that commission. Director Easterly, first of all, congratulations, and I thank you for the BOD that was issued earlier today. It's exactly the type of thing we need to do to get out ahead of cyber vulnerabilities, so thank you and CISA for that leadership. We had a discussion a little bit earlier about the public-private collaboration, JCDC, so I was very pleased when you announced the creation of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC, in August, and I think the JCDC will significantly improve the ability of the public-private sectors to collaborate on cyber defense efforts. I'd be curious on your further views on the importance of the public-private collaboration, and I hope you can share, and again, further updates on CISA's progress in standing up JCDC. Anything you'd like to add?
No, sir. I mean, we are really, really appreciative of those authorities. And I know you championed the Joint Cyber Planning Office, which is a significant part of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. And I think it's really the thing that will make the difference, being able to be proactive as opposed to reactive in planning against the most serious threats to the nation, I think is something unique across the federal government from a cyber defense perspective. So I'm really looking forward to putting that into action.
Very good, thank you. And also, Director Easterly, one idea to further the public-private collaboration developed by the Cyberspace Clearing Commission and adapted by Congressman Gallagher and I into an amendment in this year's NDAA would create critical technology security centers to evaluate and test the security of devices and technologies underpinning our nation's critical functions. I'd be curious to you about your thoughts on this measure and how it could complement JCDC.
I'm very supportive of that measure, Congressman. I think it's incredibly important that we have an ability to understand, in particular, given everything that we've seen with respect to intrusions in our supply chains, that we understand the technology that's underpinning all of these infrastructures. So fully supportive, and would want to be able to leverage the JCDC and the partners within the JCDC to be able to understand some of the information that could be tested at some of those technology centers. So would look forward to that.
And last, very quickly, I took note of your comments at Aspen Cyber Summit on the Bureau of Cyber Statistics and the need for better cybermetrics. Your thoughts on potentially housing that at CISA?
I'm a huge fan of that. I think it's hard to say that you've reduced risk unless you know how to measure it. So believe we should have that Bureau of Cyber Statistics, and I think it would make sense to house it at CISA.
Very good. Thank you again for your answers, your outstanding leadership. Look forward to our future collaborations. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Garbarino for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Katko, for having this hearing, and thank you, Director Inglis and Easterly, for both coming today. Director Easterly, I really enjoyed our conversation last week. We talked a lot of different things, even with my babysitters. I thought it was pretty productive. We talked about, and you brought it up in your opening testimony, about the cybersecurity pipeline and what you've been planning. And you talked now about, and it's not all under your control, but it is a concern making sure that you're fully staffed. And now with the cyber talent management system coming online with the rules, what do you see as your job or the CISA's Office of the Chief Human Capital Officer taking those rules and making sure that they work to make sure CISA is fully staffed and properly staffed with the right people?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I think it's something we're both passionate about. And I should first say we have fabulous people at CISA, and this really is the best job in government. But I believe that there's nothing more important than people. So we've actually spent a lot of the last 3.5 months doing a couple things. First, defining the core values and the core principles that underpin CISA's culture. Identifying how we're going to build a talent management ecosystem that allows us not just to recruit the best people, but to ensure that we are training and certifying and mentoring and coaching and retaining those best people. That's incredibly important. We've done a careful analysis of all of the 20-plus steps that it takes to actually hire somebody into the federal government, which is way too onerous. We were able to reduce by 13% the number of days that it takes to hire somebody, but it's still way too long. It's over 200. In the private sector, I could bring somebody in like 60 days. And so we need to fix all of that, but we are making progress on that. We've hired 500 some people, whereas last year it was just 200 some. So we're getting there, but not fast enough in my view. So we're going to figure out how to fix the current process, and I may come back to you and ask for your help if I need it. And then we're going to aggressively implement CTMS, which allows me much greater flexibility both to hire, but also to figure out how to retain people and incentivize them. At the end of the day, people want to come to CISA to defend their nation. But given the competitive environment, we also want to be able to pay closer to market. And so these new authorities will allow us to do that, sir.
I appreciate it. Sounds like it's easier to get elected to Congress than hire someone at CISA. On a separate note, Ranking Member Kako and I have increasingly been concerned about the security of the nation's information and communications technology. Specifically, we're concerned about the lack of progress from the Federal Acquisition Security Council. We appreciate the transparency that CIS has provided to the committee regarding its role in FASC, but we understand that CIS has only got one part of it. Director Inglis, can you speak to the lack of progress we've seen from FASC and why now 3 years in there isn't much to show for it?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. It is an important question, especially given the role that the Federal Acquisition Management Supply Chain Committee plays on the acquisition of the materiel that underpins the digital infrastructure that underpins our critical missions. Having said all of that, 3 years is a long time, but I'm pleased to report that in August of this year, we concluded the rulemaking process, gave CISA a leadership role on the FASC, have now charged the leader of that committee, who is one and the same as the Deputy for Federal Cybersecurity within the National Cyber Directorate, but at the same time, the Federal Chief Information Security Officer, to move off and beginning to apply those rules, those processes to determine how we manage the federal supply chain. We have a solid agenda for fiscal year 22, the year that we're in, and we have every expectation that we'll make significant progress in the time ahead. Be happy to come back to this committee or to deal personally with any committee member who's interested as to what those specific plans are, but to demonstrate progress in the very near term.
Great. And for either you or Director Easterly, with the authorization of FASC coming back in 2023, is there something that Congress should consider changing or giving someone more central, a more central role, or is there something we should do differently in the reauthorization or change?
I think it's a very appropriate question. I think that you should hold us accountable for delivering value with the process and the authorities that we have at the moment. I do believe that it should be sustained past fiscal year 23. We will kind of come back to you to tell you what refinements we think are necessary.
Director Easterly?
Nothing to add.
Great. I appreciate it, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for having this timely hearing. Let's see. The Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack was a stark reminder The Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack was a stark reminder that cyber attacks on critical infrastructure can have physical, real-world consequences that ripple across sectors throughout the economy. The longer it takes to restore operations, the more of those downstream effects can snowball in ways that matter for the health, safety, and financial stability of individuals and families and communities. Director Easterly, what is CISA doing to promote not just the security, but also the resiliency of critical infrastructure like pipelines to make sure they are able to get back up and running in the event of a cyber-related disruption?
Well, thanks very much for that question, and you're absolutely right. What we've seen this year is cyber attacks that are manifesting against our critical infrastructure and having real effects on the American people, whether it's gas at the pump or food at the grocery store or money at the bank. So couldn't agree with you more that we really need to lean into CISA's statutory role as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure resilience and security. And so a lot of this is, we have two main roles actually. We are what I call left of boom. As a retired military officer, we're focused on resilience and prevention of attacks. And then we are there to be able to respond effectively to a victim to help them recover and to mitigate risk to their business, and to also leverage the information that we get in an anonymized way so that we can warn other victims and prevent them from being hacked. But it comes down to our ability to work very closely with our partners at the state and local level and within critical infrastructure to ensure that they have the resources, the technical assistance, and the information that they need to be able to protect themselves. Because at the end of the day, we know that over 90% of successful cyber attacks start with the phishing email, and that you're 99% less likely to get hacked if you implement multi-factor authentication. So all of these standards and goals and information that we put out, working closely with the critical infrastructure owners and operators, incredibly important, and that's why we work closely with TSA as they articulated new standards specifically to pipelines. It's why we're working with 20+ pipeline CEOs twice a month to help them instantiate the technology that they need to protect their networks and systems and assets.
Thank you. Thank you. And how will the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative help build our national resiliency by fostering collaboration, planning, and exercising to prepare for specific cyber attack scenarios?
Yeah, great question. I'm super excited about the JCDC. I really think this is a different and unique capability for the nation. It's the place that by statute brings together the full power of the federal government with the innovation, imagination, and ingenuity of the private sector. And the reason why we chose those plank holder partners, the infrastructure companies, the cloud security providers, cloud service providers, and the cybersecurity vendors is because they afford global visibility into infrastructure that the government doesn't have and shouldn't have. And so that is how we see the dots, connect the dots, and then reduce risk at scale. And so that's how that collaboration in near real time, information being shared to enable security and resilience, and also to inform planning against the most serious threats to the nation so we can drive down risk at scale. It's one of the things that I'm most excited about, and we're already seeing dividends from the JCDC, sir. So thanks for the question.
Well, thank you for those responses. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back 20 seconds.
Gentleman is so kind. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member and our witnesses for being here today. Every day, the importance of our cybersecurity systems grows as a matter of national security. The number of publicly reported cyber attacks and breaches for 2021 are unfortunately on track to be the highest and most impactful in history. The cost of ransomware damage is expected to reach $265 billion by 2031, and personally, I think that's a light number. Our foreign adversaries are rapidly increasing their cyber skills and stealth. We're also currently seeing the disastrous consequences involved with supply chain vulnerability. Supply chain cyber attacks have risen by 42% just in the first quarter of this year. According to Blue Voyant, a third-party cyber risk management company, 97% of firms have been negatively impacted by a cybersecurity breach in their supply chain. Further, 1 out of 5 small businesses fall victim to a cyber attack in the U.S., and of those, 60% go out of business within 6 months. It's a serious problem. Our adversaries should have a clear understanding that the United States can and will execute effective and timely consequences if they attack our national critical cyber infrastructure. Deterrence and response, in my opinion, are critical aspects to our mission to address the cyber threats that we're currently experiencing and the threats of tomorrow. Director Inglis, non-state criminal actors are responsible for many cyber attacks in the U.S., including last year's ransomware attacks on our hospital systems and the Colonial Pipeline attack. The U.S. has had difficulty, however, in the past executing counterattack strikes against cyber terrorists. For example, in 2016, the U.S. Cyber Command worked to destroy ISIS communications and remove pro-ISIS propaganda, which only worked for a couple of days. They were right back up. Certainly wasn't an effective counterstrike. So, in your professional opinion, is the United States capable of launching an effective cyber counterstrike against cyber criminals worldwide? Because this is the question that Americans want to know. Can we strike back? Do we have the will? Do we have the capability? And if we do have the will and the capability, then why are we not lighting these criminals up with a counterstrike cyber attack? And I ask you for your response.
Congressman, thanks very much for the question. I'm sure that's the question on the mind of many people who are aware and watching the growing threat in cyberspace. I agree with your characterization of the growing seriousness of these threats and the perception that we're falling further behind. I would offer that it is important to bring transgressors to justice. I would offer that the set of tools we should bring to bear is considerably larger than simply finding and shooting at them using cyber activities in and through cyberspace. So that is an important part of the solution, but equally important is a campaign that covers all the ways that we can thwart their efforts. We need to begin with increased resilience and robustness in the technology, in the skills of our people, in the doctrine, the roles and responsibilities. We're talking a lot today about how do we collaborate as opposed to achieve simply a division of effort such that these transgressors have to beat all of us to beat one of us. Having established a defensible enterprise, we then need to actually defend it. That's a very proactive set of endeavors. Jen Easterly at CISA and other sector risk management agencies are leading the collaboration of the federal enterprise with the critical information and critical sector to do just that. Finally, we need to align actions to consequences. An important piece of that, as you suggest, is finding and bringing to justice these transgressors, stopping their further efforts. But we need to use all the instruments of power at our disposal. We need to be able to...
Sir, in the interest of time, I have 10 seconds remaining. Let me just close. Thank you for your answer. But in my opinion, we need to have a lightning-fast cyber counterstrike. There needs to be immediate consequences, and then we can still bring them to justice. That takes a long time. Mr. Chairman, I yield, and I encourage my colleagues to support a very proactive and aggressive cyber counterstrike as we face these ongoing attacks. Thank you for holding this hearing today.
Gentleman yields
I'd be
back.
happy to
Chair
follow.
recognizes gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing for a variety of reasons. I'm on Homeland Security, but I'm also on financial services. And we also have a great deal of interest in and ability to work with CISA. And Director Easterly, thank you. Since CISA was created back a couple of years ago, the agency now has a recognizable name. I think when CISA first was created, a lot of people said CISA and they thought it was a hip hop band. But now I think it's recognizable, and you are serving a great purpose dealing with security, public and private. But you have a far-flung and almost cryptic kind of a mission, and I'm wondering, what would you want your grandchildren to brag about when they become adults, as it relates to what you were able to do at CISA? I mean, what do you envision down the road as something that is significant that you really want to do and may even need the help the chair, the ranking member, and this entire committee in getting it done?
Thank you for that great question, sir. My son is 17, and I often tell him how excited I am to someday be a grandmother, which I think is a little off-putting to him since he's a junior in high school. But I am excited for that day because I like babies. But it's a great question. And, you know, I've thought about this through my career, through 21 years in the military, several combat tours, working at the White House, working in the intelligence community. Much of what I'm doing is motivated so that my parents and my brothers and sisters and my son and my husband are proud of me. And I would hope that my grandkids could say, she helped make America safer. And so that is my goal, is to ensure the security and resilience of the infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day to get power, to get water, to get food at the grocery store, to get money at the bank, to get gas at the pump. These are the networks that underpin our lives, and my mission is to ensure that they are secure and resilient.
Is there a priority? Is there something that that is so critically important to the agency that you want to direct as much attention to it as possible? The number one thing, or is there a number one thing, or is the mission so massive that it's difficult to set anything aside?
Well, I don't think I mean, it is a big mission, and I think it's a critically important mission, sir, but I think it's pretty simple. You know, our mission is to lead the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to cyber and physical critical infrastructure. We do that in two main ways. We're the operational lead for federal cybersecurity, and we're the national coordinator for critical infrastructure security and resilience. My top priority to ensure that this agency is successful is to make sure that we have the talent we need to be able to operationalize our various missions. But my goal, again, is to really ensure that infrastructure, whether it's owned by critical infrastructure owners at the state and local level or with the federal government, is secure and resilient to cyber attacks from nation-state actors and cyber criminals.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to beat Mr. Payne. I want to yield back 50 seconds.
Gentleman's real kind. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson. I want to thank our guest for testifying and for being here. From reading your backgrounds of both of you, y'all really have the background to do a great job with what I consider the threat that this country's facing every day. That's, you know, we've got so many that we know about, but the ones we don't know about, and I'm from small business and know a lot of businesses that would not report the attacks on their particular company because of loss of stock value and, you know, the fact that they just do not want it publicized. But and I know y'all haven't been on the job, but, you know, 6, 8 months, but if what you put in place, and since you've been there for the time that you have, would the colonial attack be able to occur now, or do you have the mechanisms in place to stop that?
Mr. Congressman, thank you very much for the question. It's an excellent question. I can't say for certain whether we would prevent the next Colonial Pipeline attack. I believe that we're in a much better position to detect it, if not deter it. The things we have done ensure that to the extent that any one of us has a small piece of understanding about what might be transpiring in the shared domain of cyberspace, we're now in a better position to share that richly, quickly, and a granularity that it is then useful. It's actionable intelligence. We're also able at this point to better respond to those activities such that we can surge support to the point of need and restore not simply resilience and robustness to the system quickly, but confidence that the systems will work on our behalf. But I have to be quite clear, quite honest about saying the technical debt, the lack of investment for so many years is long in the making. It won't be turned around in a fortnight. We need to make sure at this moment we're making best use of the components, the authorities, and that we apply those in an integrated and collaborative fashion such that increasingly an adversary needs to beat all of us to beat one of us. That should be a daunting proposition for them.
What about, we've got an open border. This country is petrified of what's going on with the border. Anybody and everybody from any country is coming in. We don't know who they are. We don't know what country they represent. All we know is we are not doing any background. They're basically coming across the border unfettered. And how and this is for either one of you, how are y'all dealing with that? And what threat is this that we face, known or unknown, that you see?
Mr. Congressman, I'll start with the question. I assume that you're extending that analogy into cyberspace. I think it's quite apt. Cyber is essentially a set of open borders, which we might confer some degree of jurisdiction based upon geography, but in cyberspace, geography means very little, absent the authorities that are bound within the United States based upon that geography. So we have to make sure that we understand what's happening across those borders, that we can better identify the transgressors who come at us from across those borders, and that we can better deal with the sum of the authorities we bring to bear based upon both domestic and national security authorities. All of that's a very daunting proposition in the borderless space of cyberspace. I believe we have the means to do that, but we have to better identify those threats, better secure the infrastructure that we mean to defend, and collaborate on top of that to bring all our resources to bear.
And I would only add, absolutely. I mean, some of the complexity, a large part of the complexity of our jobs is that we are dealing with cyberspace, which is borderless. But just to add to Director Inglis's comments from earlier, I think we are making progress in ensuring that there are fewer colonial pipeline type hacks, but at the end of the day, the government can only do so much. A lot of this is the private sector making sure that they are implementing the standards and the cyber hygiene that they need to protect their systems and networks. We are here as a trusted partner to provide assistance, to provide standards, to provide information, but a lot of this has to be the basics of cyber hygiene. So I look forward to continuing to work with small businesses, the private sector, so that they have the information that they need to be able to protect themselves.
Well, yeah, and y'all play a vital role with that, and I hope you can. And I realize cybersecurity doesn't have a border, but what we're doing is letting people in that are embedded in our communities that are coming to our country. And we've got Duke Power in my district, and EMP attacks, which is an attack on this country, is of great concern to all of us. Thank you so much. I think my time is up. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our ranking member and our witnesses for appearing today and lending their expertise to the subject matter. Let me start with Director Inglis. As you know, Congress established the Office of National Cyber Director in part to address the longstanding interagency coordination challenges and turf wars that existed between CISA, sector risk management agencies, and other federal agencies with cyber missions. Can you distinguish between the role of ONCD plays as opposed to the role played by the National Security Council and CISA's role as the lead federal coordinator for critical infrastructure protection?
Yes, Congresswoman, that's, I think, an important question. And so I think the answer would be that those roles are complementary. They're applied concurrently. They're not necessarily hierarchical. At the same time that CISA is the on-the-field quarterback equipped with resources and authorities to coordinate the defense within the federal enterprise and the support of the federal government to the critical infrastructure, the National Cyber Director has to make sure that the roles and responsibilities, as you indicate, of CISA and the sector risk management agencies is clear, that they're prepared to act in a complementary fashion, and that their performance is up to par in terms of our expectations. At the same time, the National Security Council, and in the form of Ann Neuberger, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology, applies instruments of power that are outside of cyberspace to bring about desired conditions inside cyberspace. Our intelligence assets, our military assets, our diplomatic assets, our legal assets, our financial assets, all of that is traditionally the role of the National Security Council. If we do those three roles concurrently, they can complement one another such that the sum of the parts is greater than the arithmetic sum.
Wonderful. So in your experience thus far as the first ever U.S. National Cyber Director, how confident are you that ONCD will be able to unify federal cyber efforts around a common vision and shared purpose?
I think I'm not in a position to ultimately judge my own performance, but I think that we can make a difference. I think that that is the point of accountability that should be imposed on me. Did the system perform better? Are we, in fact, more coherent, cohesive in the application of these very impressive pieces at the end of the day? I think we can and will make a difference.
Awesome. Director Easterly, would you care to weigh in on the dynamics between ONCD and CISA and whether you see these roles as complementary of each other and any areas for improvement?
Thanks so much for the question, Congresswoman. As Chris and I have talked about, and we go back about 15 years, so we've known each other for a while, and I think, I often say technology is easy, people are hard. And so you have to have that trust to build that collaborative partnership. And fortunately, Chris and I have been friends for a long time. We talk about our relationship as he being the coach, me being the quarterback, but we know that there are all players on the field. And I think even in just the last 3.5 months, we have forged a highly collaborative, highly cohesive relationship with our teammates across the federal government. This is about one team, one fight, cyber as a team sport. No drama, no ego, no tribalism, no turf. It's about getting the job done. So it's not Cobra Kai versus Miyagi-Do. It's Cobra Kai and Miyagi-Do against all the bad guys.
Wonderful. It's so refreshing to hear that response of we're maturing as an agency. Director Inglis, in the wake of the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, we saw what I would describe as a breakdown of the PPD 41 framework and a failure to execute the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. Specifically, the Department of Energy was given the lead role in the federal incident response efforts, despite being neither the lead for asset response under PPD 41, nor the Sector Risk Management Agency for the pipeline subsector. What guardrails have been put in place since then to ensure that the next time the U.S. has to respond to a significant cyber attack on our nation's critical infrastructure, the lines of effort articulated under PPD 41 will be observed?
Thank you for the question. As you indicate, PPD 41 remains a quite useful and appropriate document to guide our efforts in the moment of contingency or crisis, say a repeat, God forbid, of the Colonial Pipeline. I think that what we have done since then, and certainly in the last 3.5 months now that Director Easterly and I have assumed these roles, is to double down on our efforts to understand what the role of CISA is. It's increasingly clear what that role is. It's the coordinator. To double down on how then that relates to the sector risk management agencies, to understand what the lanes of effort are, how they complement one another, such that in the heat of the next contingency or crisis, we will be based upon not simply what the rules are laid out in PPD 41, but tested and exercised roles and relationships based upon not simply professional trust, but the personal relationships that we've established to know how we would respond in that crisis.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
So, Mr. English, so let me understand what you just said. You said personal relationships. Are you saying those personal relationships override the policy?
I do not, sir. So thank you for the question and the opportunity to clarify. I think those professional relationships are well described in law, in policy, and ultimately in the administrative rules that are established. But personal relationships can complement those and ensure that you effect those not simply as a division of effort, but in a collaborative fashion. I spend quite a lot of time trying to understand what the challenges and the authorities are of Jen Easterly or the sector risk management agencies so that I can put myself in their stead and understand what I need to do to support them. That is based upon personal trust as much or more as executing fully and faithfully the authorities and the rules that are inculcated in statute and policy.
But you do recognize that the policies at the end of the day
I do, sir, without equivocation.
The driving force behind what you do.
Without equivocation. If I might, I would just say that I think that a transformative feature of what we're proposing is that we can fully and faithfully execute the law and the policies in a way that might equate to a division of effort, that we then meet at seams that are defined by those laws and policies, which are very important. But we also need to go further to try to understand what more we can do to aid and abet the activities to the left of us, to the right of us, to achieve a degree of collaboration, which means that we have to work harder and essentially have a degree of personal addition to those as opposed to subtraction from those.
But somebody has to be in charge.
At any moment in time, we need to know who is accountable for what. Yes, sir.
Absolutely. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our nation's safety and security are being challenged by our enemies through cyberspace. And as we have seen over the last year, these attacks can lie dormant for many months before being detected and can have devastating consequences on our economy and our way of life. Further complicating these threats is the fact that cyber attacks can be carried out by both state and non-state actors and can be relatively inexpensive to execute. There seems to be limited tools at our disposal that enable us to immediately respond to a cyber attack and hold perpetrators accountable. In many ways, cyber attacks have emerged as a near-perfect weapon against our nation, especially the civilians in our nation. So to both of you, thank you for continuing to provide valuable insight into what steps are needed to strengthen our cybersecurity and to respond appropriately when the attacks are successful. As my colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, highlighted, I think the best defense is a good offense, but we definitely need both. And the civilian sector needs a stronger defense, but they've got to know what resources are there to help them too. So my first question is for CISA Director Easterly. Director Easterly, this past month was Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and CISA launched their annual effort to educate the public on good cyber hygiene practices and the resources that CISA offers. Numerous members in Congress, including myself, did what we could to amplify your agency's message with our constituents. Things like public service announcements, speaking on the House floor, directing people to your CISA website for further education, speaking to local clubs, including Rotaries and that sort of thing. But what other steps can members take to support CISA's mission in each of our districts? Because, honestly, when I spoke to a local Rotary, there was only one person in that room, and there was a number of folks there that actually knew what CISA was. And, you bring tremendous resources to the table. How can we make America more aware of what you've got?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much for your leadership and your support. It's great to have members weighing in on this important issue, so thanks for that. We are the newest agency in the federal government. We're going to have our 3rd birthday here on November 16th. So it's probably not terribly surprising that some folks don't know who CISA is, what CISA is, how to correctly pronounce CISA. But at the end of the day, I do think, sir, we are making progress. And part of that is the help of Congress, but also we have a fantastic field force. We have over 500 people, cybersecurity advisors, protected security advisors out there working with state and local, your constituents, other constituents, and critical infrastructure owners and operators to render assistance to ensure they have the information they need to be able to protect themselves. And so we're going to continue with this campaign. But I agree with you. We need a campaign like Click It or Ticket or Smokey the Bear or This Is Your Brain on Drugs, something that really makes an impact on the American people so that they know exactly what they need to do to protect themselves and to implement multi-factor authentication.
Thank you. To follow up on that, you recently discussed CISA's initial work to map out our nation's primary systemically important entities. And as you know, there are legislative proposals that would require CISA to accomplish this goal, including one authored by Ranking Member Katko and Mr. Garbarino. And I applaud your agency for taking the initiative without Congress having to get involved. However, could you tell me, has CISA run into any obstacles in identifying these entities that are critical to our nation's security, and do you believe legislation would help CISA overcome these obstacles? Is there any way that we can help in that regard?
You know, as I've said, I think it would be very useful to codify systemically important critical infrastructure, or what we call PICEs, primary systemically important entities. But we're going to do that work notwithstanding. We have not hit any obstacles, but I'll tell you, I mean, we want to do this right. And so ensuring we have the rigorous methodology to be able to identify these systemically important entities based on network centrality, economic centrality, logical dominance, and national critical functions. That's a tough effort. It's an important effort, but we have to be able to identify them, and then we have to measure how we reduce risk. This can't just be about advising on risk or managing risk. It has to be about reducing risk, and we have to measure what matters, and part of that is being able to articulate those SICIs or PICEs in the first principles.
All right, thank you. And in just a couple seconds left, Director Inglis, you know, as I said, I'm very interested in support a great offense.
Gentlemen's seconds have expired.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member. I think this has been a very informative hearing, and I regret that I've been in another hearing and am not able to follow all of what's been, and ourselves being in two places at once and difficult to achieve. Let's start with what I believe the public perceives as an issue. Just the mere notion that the federal government cannot protect its networks. It's probably hard for the typical consumer to understand how the federal government can't protect its networks, and if it can't, then there is probably a belief that it's going to be difficult for the private sector to secure its networks. Perhaps this has been answered, but do we have, in collaborating with the private sector, have we identified the private sector networks that are so important to our country that we, the federal government, should have a greater hand in protecting them? Whoever would like to respond to do so.
Congressman, if I could start with that and then defer to my counterpart, Jen Easterly, to complete the answer. I think first and foremost, you properly point to the public's expectation that federal networks will be properly built, properly defended to deliver the functions, the services that they expect. We've taken aggressive effort to do that. The executive order in May, the binding operational directive that Ms. Easterly talked about earlier in this hearing are both aimed at doing just that, but we have further work to do. As to whether we should take then further effort to define the critical functions that serve the public, both within and within the private sector, there is further work to be done in that regard. We call that systemically critical infrastructure. It's a challenge to define what that is, given there are so many possibilities and therefore so many components that underpin those possibilities. But CISA has taken that work on, and with the support of this Congress and this committee in particular, I think that we can make progress.
Does the lady desire to have a comment?
Sir, was that for me?
Yes, ma'am. Sorry. Did you have a response?
Yeah, thank you. I would just add to Director Inglis's points. We are, in fact, moving out on identifying that primary systemically important entities. It is a serious and complex effort. We're working through it, and so I'm hopeful that we'll have a preliminary view on that in the coming months. And I would absolutely agree with you that the federal government has to lead by example. The private sector can't look at us and expect us to not be able to defend our own network. So all of the work we're doing pursuant to the President's EO to modernize our federal civilian executive branch networks, to create visibility, to ensure that we can actually manage that enterprise as an enterprise, not as 102 separate little tribes. We are working very aggressively to do that, and I'm optimistic that we're going to make a real difference because I think we all know that the status quo is unacceptable.
Thank you. With my 1 minute and 10 or so seconds left, let's talk quickly about diversity, workforce diversity. It is my understanding that CISA recently announced a $2 million grant or grants bring cybersecurity training to rural and diverse communities. What are the processes that we're putting in place to make sure that we do this in an efficacious way? My concern is that rural and minority communities too often are left behind, and this is a great opportunity to make sure that they're brought into the fold. Can you give me some sense of what the process will be to make sure that we're doing this appropriately?
Yeah,
Some asset tests.
Thanks for asking that question. I'm hugely passionate about this. I am a big believer that you have to build a talent management ecosystem that allows you to tap into diverse pipelines, because that diversity that looks like America will enable us to solve the toughest problems. I've always believed that since my early days as one of the few women at West Point, and in my time in the private sector where I built an organization that was 50% women, 25% Black and Hispanic. So the kind of things that we're moving out on are lessons that I've drawn from previous aspects in my career. You point to the great grants, $1 million for NPower, $1 million for the Cyber Warrior Foundation, focused on developing unrealized talent in underserved communities. And that's just the beginning. We're also working to create a pipeline with things like the Girl Scouts. We just created a collaborative relationship with Girls Who Code. I'm looking forward to working with folks on this committee to be able to tap into historically Black colleges and universities to create a vibrant pipeline there. And I am open to all great ideas. So I'd love to work with you, Congressman, if this is a passion of yours as well.
It is a passion. And Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the time. That's one of the better answers that I've heard. I look forward to working with you, ma'am, if you'll contact my office. Thank you so much.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Inglis, in your written testimony on page 4, you talk about 3 categories of threat that warrant continued effort and attention. I want to specifically talk about the 3rd category. You say that we must remain laser focused on maintaining the integrity of our information and telecommunications infrastructure against high-risk actors. Large portions of the hardware supply chain underpinnings our most critical such technologies are located in countries that could leverage it for intelligence gatherings or disruption at global scale. So can you talk a little bit about the supply chain challenges that we are seeing today?
Thank you very much for that question. I think that there's a growing awareness that the digital infrastructure that supports critical functions, or for that matter, personal functions broadly across our society, is at risk. It's at risk because it's not been built to be, by design, resilient and robust. It's at risk because we don't collaborate and integrate in the defense of that. Essentially, the stovepipes that sit side by side add primary value to those supply chains without understanding what the resilience and robustness is from start to finish across those supply chains. And as you've indicated, many of those lie outside our physical boundaries, our borders, such that we have to then depend upon the collaboration of others, other nations, to effect the resilience, robustness, and the defensive same. Approaching that then means that we have to reconsider how do we build those supply chains, invest resilience and robustness in those supply chains, how do we defend those supply chains. An important piece of that will be collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. Some of that might mean that we have to reshore some of those supply chains to find places where we can build the key components, manufacture and add value to those components with like-minded nations or within this nation. All of that work before us, I think, transcends both cyber and the physical space. And so it is in fact a strategy that is underway, and it's a collaborative activity between the private and the public sector.
Outside of Congress incentivizing companies to return and manufacture many of these critical components in the United States, is there anything else that we can do as a Congress to try to bring those supply chains back here domestically, so we're not depending upon countries, particularly countries in the Far East. I think of China and the growing threat of China, how many of the components that we need for things that we do on a regular basis are manufactured in China. We've seen the CCP continue to grow. You even list here in your testimony that countries can use some of the hardware manufactured in other countries for intelligence gathering. And so I guess my first question is, outside of incentivizing companies, giving tax relief, tax breaks for companies to bring production back to the United States, is there anything that we can do as a Congress to continue to encourage that?
I think there are three broad points of influence that we can bring to bear. You've mentioned one of those, incentives, trying to create market forces that will essentially push these supply chains, these supply lines in the right direction for resilience and robustness and the confidence that pertains. Another is simply awareness. There is insufficient awareness about what the true challenge is, where these supply chains lie. We then find ourselves surprised, right, in a SolarWinds escapade to understand where this comes from and how perhaps adversaries might insinuate themselves into that. The Congress can be very helpful, and this committee has been specifically and particularly helpful in that regard. Finally, some degree of accountability. When market forces fail, when incentives fail, we need to understand what are the truly critical functions that our nation depends upon and ensure that those parties who are responsible for delivering that and defending that are specifically held accountable. Director Easterly and I sit before you as accountable parties to kind of make sure that the federal government's doing its part. The private sector also has a part to play, and by exception, we need to understand what those roles and responsibilities are and effect accountability.
And have you seen specific instances where countries have used their supply chain being a critical component for intelligence gathering? I know you list that here in your written testimony. Have you seen examples of that? And then two, are there any that you could share with this committee? And I know there may be things which you have awareness of that you're not able to share in this type of setting, but just specifically, if there are any that you could share, I would appreciate that.
I would be pleased in the appropriate setting to speak to intelligence matters that would kind of point to the opportunities that various nations might have given the current disposition of supply chains. Unfortunately, for the purposes of this discussion, those are matters that are likely classified in terms of those opportunities.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Slotkin.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a warm welcome to our witnesses. Really glad to have excellent experts, and I echo Ranking Member Katko's comments that I feel like we have the best team in place and we're working in a really positive bipartisan way on something that is an issue that really connects high policy in Washington to every family back home in our districts, and it's rare that that happens. But after the attacks on Colonial Pipeline and JBS, I find myself increasingly in front of communities, often in rural communities, where I'm there to talk about something very different, and the first question they ask me, from farmers to school teachers and superintendents, is, what are we doing to protect ourselves from this onslaught of attacks? I would note I had a big group of superintendents in my office yesterday, and every single one of them had had ransomware attacks, and many had paid the ransom to get the school data back. But what I want to know, I think echo some of my colleagues, I want to be able to tell people back home that we're doing everything we can to defend them. And I understand that a lot of our offensive things are classified and we don't talk about them in public. But I'm interested in the defensive side, and in particular, what the president laid down on the 16 different categories of infrastructure that he told Vladimir Putin were off limits. Can you lay out for us, since the summit between the president and Putin, and the president laying down that marker, have we seen attacks from Russian-based groups, particularly those groups that were responsible for some of our biggest, disruptions? Have you seen a decrease, an increase, or no change in their level of attempts to attack us?
I'll start with that. Thank you very much for that excellent question, I'm sure on the minds of most, if not all, of our citizens. I think that answering the question head on, we have seen a discernible decrease. It's too soon to tell whether that is because of the material efforts undertaken by the Russians or the Russian leadership. It may well be that the transgressors in this space have simply kind of lain low, understanding that, that this is, for the moment, a very hot time for them. And we need to make sure that that continues to be the case, that we continue to build resilience and robustness in our infrastructure. We continue to work hard to understand who's transgressing across that infrastructure and use all the tools at our disposal to bring them to justice. I think in the longer term, we will be able to measure in a qualitative and a quantitative fashion what the diminishment of those efforts are. For the moment, I think it's too soon to tell. We therefore need to ensure that our strategy is solidified and brought to bear.
Okay, so I would just ask for your commitment, since we know that some of these groups sometimes go dark for a short time while the media's attention is on them, and then they come back to life, that I would offer we should have that conversation again iteratively in this committee to make sure that the Russians are living up to a basic commitment to stop what's going on based out of their territory. I think the other issue, I think Ms. Easterly, is I think one of my colleagues mentioned, I don't think the American public knows the 911 number to call when their school, when their farm, when their processing plant, when their local government is attacked. And of course, there are state offices that handle some of these things. But is it appropriate to think of CISA as the federal 911 that we call when we see one of our infrastructure nodes being attacked?
Certainly, we welcome, first of all, the cyber incident reporting legislation, where if there is an attack of some sort, people would come to us and let us know, because we are there to render assistance, but we can also use that information to prevent others from being hacked. So I would want people to recognize CISA both as those people that you call to get help, but really those people are helping to raise the whole cybersecurity baseline and creating goodness for the entire defense of the nation. So I hope to get to that point, Congresswoman, and I would love to partner with you on that.
Yeah, and then lastly, I would say, the best, offense is a good defense, and we know that our private sector has an important role to play. Do the companies you engage with get that they are part of our national security apparatus, that they have a role to play, particularly in infrastructure, in protecting the United States, and therefore have to maintain the highest standards, unlike some of our pipelines and others that we've seen recently?
Yeah, I would certainly say that I've been incredibly encouraged, both from my time in the private sector within finance, but since that I arrived at CISA and have been working directly with private sector companies to include ISPs, CSPs, cybersecurity vendors, infrastructure providers, who get that this is a national security imperative. And so have been encouraged, am optimistic, but we're going to continue to collaborate and strengthen those partnerships to make sure that this is really a national endeavor to protect the country.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko. I appreciated the questions by all of my colleagues and Representative Slotkin, who just spoke, especially in reference to cyber attacks and ransomware. So JBS is in my district. And it was affected, less so the plant within my district than the entire infrastructure of JBS. And I've also, as a state senator, worked on legislation for ransomware attacks that our local government had experienced when they've been hacked. And interesting enough, when people communicated to me in my district about the provision of the reconciliation bill with the increase in IRS agents and looking into accounts where there was a $600 transaction, often I was asked about hacking and did this make us less secure? So I think this is an extraordinarily important topic, and I appreciate Chairman Thompson bringing this forward today. Director Easterly, on the topic of the new CISA authorities provided in last year's NDAA, one of the more important provisions authorizes CISA to subpoena internet service providers to obtain contact information for critical infrastructure operators where CISA has identified vulnerable devices on the internet, and so that these devices can be secured before they are attacked. Can you provide the committee a status update on the implementation? How many subpoenas has CISA issued to date?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really, really important authority. We have issued over, I believe, 35 administrative subpoenas to date, and we have seen, because we go back and we rescan the infrastructure where we saw those vulnerabilities, we've rescanned that and we've saw those vulnerabilities actually get closed. So we believe this tool is enabling us to mitigate and remediate vulnerabilities and to make folks aware of vulnerabilities that they probably were not tracking. So we've used that aggressively since we've gotten it, and I'm really pleased to say that we've operationalized it in a way that is helping us reduce risk.
So you answered one of my follow-up questions, so I'm going to go to the next one. Have you identified any shortcomings of the program that you think need to be addressed?
Well, since we're just in the I guess about 6 months, 9 months of operationalization. I have not yet seen specific shortcomings, but I will absolutely come back to you and let you know if we need something different or more from this authority.
I think with the recent attacks, people are much more aware of this now, so it is a topic of conversation. So thank you, and we would appreciate the feedback. I also think that all of us are in agreement that we need to double down on our efforts to provide proactive vulnerability identification to critical infrastructure entities, particularly those that identify as being particularly critical for economic and national security. And I think we've heard this from several members. We don't want a single point of failure resulting in cascading impact for the country at large. Do we have the processes and technology in place to execute on this proactive vulnerability identification and notification at scale? And are we effectively looking at vulnerabilities across critical infrastructure community through the eyes of an attacker?
I'll start and happy for Director Inglis to weigh in. I think it's exactly the right question. As we know, everything is connected, everything is interdependent these days, everything sits on that technology baseline, and therefore everything is potentially vulnerable. So we work very hard to make sure that business owners, small and large, critical infrastructure owners and operators, state and local, the American people, have a good understanding of what they need to do to ensure that their software is patched, to ensure that we're taking care of vulnerabilities and to have the basics that we need. I would also commend the incredible research community, those researchers, those academics, those hackers out there who are doing yeoman's work in being able to help identify these vulnerabilities, bring them to us through the Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure Platform, because that helps make us all safer and more secure. I would point to the binding operational directive, ma'am, that we issued today that I think is really groundbreaking in that for the first time, this is really giving timelines to remediate those specific vulnerabilities that we know have been actively exploited by adversaries, not just all vulnerabilities, but the ones that we think are most dangerous. And I think that can make a real difference, not just for federal agencies, but from a signaling perspective for our critical infrastructure owners and operators and from businesses large and small around the country.
Thank you so much. And Director Inglis, I apologize. I've run out of time, so I won't be able to get your answer to this, but thank you so much. And thank you, Chairman Thompson. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I have to run to vote in another committee. I'd like to delay my 5 minutes. Thank you very much. I'll come back to the committee when I finish voting. Thank you.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't realize I was going to be next, but I appreciate it. I'd like to ask Mr. Inglis and Ms. Easterly both a couple of questions. One is in our subcommittee on transportation and marine policy. Last week, we learned that there are many cybersecurity vulnerabilities at our travel hubs, including airports. I represent McCarran Airport, and we know that as people travel, we want them to be safe physically, but we also want their data to be safe. You see everybody plugging in their computers everywhere and working on them. And then when they get on the plane, they continue to use Wi-Fi from the airlines and for in-flight services. And I wonder if you two could address what we might be doing to make that more secure.
Thank you very much for the question. I'll start, and Director Easterly, I'm sure, will complement that. I think there are at least two dimensions to this. One is, as per some earlier conversations we've had, there are in these locations systemically critical infrastructure upon which the public depends. How do we coordinate the flow of air traffic? How do we ensure that flight plans are securely communicated? How do we make sure that the data flows that underpin the safety of that industry is properly defended? The work that CISA and others are doing to determine what those systemically critical components are and the entities responsible for those will allow us to focus the very precious resources we have in a prioritized way to increase resilience and robustness and the defense of same. To the extent that individuals make use of individual services for their personal or perhaps their business activities, we need to make sure that as a matter of the commodities provided to them, that security is built in. We also need to make sure that they're aware of what their alternatives are, and that in the case where there is a risk that we haven't found a way to buy down, that they understand that that's a risk that they can choose to take or not take. So some degree of cyber education, training, and awareness is also essential, and we need to kind of get that into our people's skills at the earliest possible moment.
Yeah, and I would only add, I completely agree with that. A lot of this, clearly from a standards perspective, we work closely with TSA as they're the sector risk management agency for aviation, for rail. But this also comes down to public awareness, making sure people understand the basics of password hygiene, updating their software, implementing multi-factor authentication, making sure that if you're a business, you are patching those vulnerabilities. So we've got to come at it from both angles, from a personal angle, but also from a government federal agency angle. It's got to be a team sport.
Thank you. And speaking of government agencies working with others, I would ask you about the relationship with universities and how we can strengthen that. I represent the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and they have a cyber center that's been recognized by DHS and the NSA. It's a National Center of Academic Excellence in Cyber Defense Education. And they're working to create a clinic where students can help small businesses if they get hacked, because we know if a small business is hacked, 60% of them go out of business as a result of that. So could you talk about maybe how we could strengthen the relationship between the federal government and the universities to do things like help small businesses?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, I love that clinic idea. I'd love to come visit if that's cool. But we are working very hard.
Anytime.
Awesome. So you mentioned the Centers of Academic Excellence that is sponsored by both DHS and NSA. It is a fantastic program, and it's really part of our strategy to be able to tap into these schools, as well as community colleges, historically Black universities and colleges, to create that pipeline for the next generation of cyber talent. So the kind of things that you are doing are exactly what we want to amplify. We want to tap into some of those students that are already cyber superstars, and our cyber talent management system will allow us to hire these folks based on their aptitude and their collaborative attitude, as opposed to somebody having to get a PhD or a master's degree.
And if I could double down on that and commend the clinic in a particular and specific way, which is the clinic idea actually has many, many beneficiaries. Of course, it benefits the local businesses that are serviced by those clinics. Of course, it's a component of the education of those students. But importantly, it bridges the gap between education and practice in ways that so many institutions have been challenged. When a student arrives with a degree or a certificate at the front door of a business that they want to work for, they often lack the experience necessary to prove that they can do the job at the very first moment. And so I think you've solved a number of challenges in one fell swoop. So I would commend that for others to follow.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. I'll let UNLV know your comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Letourneau, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. I was on the phone call yesterday with a constituent of mine who owns a small business in Kansas. And he had a ransomware attack, and they asked for $900,000, which is a lot for this business. It's a lot for any business, but certainly a lot for this one. And I asked the question, I said, did your insurers or did the lawyers or the technical experts at any stage tell you you need to report this to a federal agency, that you need to make this known? And he said, no, to the contrary. They said it's a waste of time. Now, I don't think you would agree that it's a waste of time, and I'd like you to address that. And assuming that you don't think it's a waste of time, how do we begin to change this narrative across the country?
I'm happy to start, or go ahead, please. So first of all, I have great empathy for these small businesses that are getting hacked. They are put in a terrible position, and I think they often do pay. Now, we say as a government, you should not pay because it incentivizes that criminal ecosystem, but a lot of these folks...
They got it down to $600,000, but they were losing $2 million a day.
Yeah, it's incredibly tough
decisions. It's a tough spot.
I totally hear you. So part of this is making sure that businesses have everything that they need to prevent getting hacked, and frankly, the resources and assistance and information we provide can help with that. But at the end of the day, we have a field force that can actually render assistance to help folks understand if they get hacked, what they can do about it, how they can recover and mitigate risk. And if they do report to us, I think very importantly, which is why I'm a fan of this legislation, we can use that information to prevent others from being hacked. But I would tell you, you should tell your constituent, go to stopransomware.gov, which has been looked at uniquely almost 500,000 times. There's a huge amount of information. What ransomware is, how do you deal with it, how do you prevent yourself from getting hacked?
It's hard for me to add value to that answer. I think it's a complete and fulsome answer. I think that they should call such that then we can better support them in their time of need, that we can take the information necessary and invest in the future. But it is our job as a federal government working in collaboration with the private sector to prevent these events in the future. StopRansomware.gov is an excellent kind of body of information to allow individuals, businesses to kind of act in their own defense. But there's more that we can do to get ahead of this to make sure that we're left of that event.
You're both certainly aware of that attitude being very prevalent throughout the country in the business sector.
We are. The government needs to actually, it needs to lead with a practice such that when you call the government actually responds with meaningful support. What Director Easterly has laid out is an initiative, a set of initiatives across the federal government that have begun to do that. But we need to demonstrate that value such that the first thinking of an individual business or citizen is I need to call the government because they've shown themselves willing, able to assist me in this time of need.
Let's talk about the JCDC. So I know it just launched in August officially. Talk about the promise of that and how you think that's going to help the coordination, because that's one of the big concerns that I have, is that there's so many different departments that have a piece of this. You know, for example, the White House chose the Department of Energy to deal with the colonial attacks. And so what is the promise of that, and how are you going to make sure that we are actually coordinating and that Congress and our oversight function can actually hold someone accountable? Because it's incredibly frustrating when it's so spread out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I'm incredibly motivated on this one, sir, and I will come back and ask this committee for help if I need it. You can hold me accountable if the JCDC fails, but I'll tell you, I'm motivated because even though I spent 27 years in government before I went to the private sector, when I showed up in the private sector, it felt like you needed a PhD in government to deal with the US government, right? You were getting different signal, different information from different agencies. It was totally unhelpful and incoherent, even as good as government agencies and well-meaning as they are. So the beauty of the JCDC is, by law, it brings together the power of the federal government, not just CISA, but NSA and FBI and DOD and DOJ and ODNI and Secret Service and the National Cyber Director as one entity to collaborate with state and local, with critical infrastructure owners and operators, and with those cybersecurity companies, ISPs and CSPs that have the global visibility to allow us to illuminate those dots so we can connect them and drive down risk at scale. This is not about just weekly meetings on partnership, hey, how are you, let's have coffee together. It's really about how do we operationally collaborate in a professionally intimate, shoulder to shoulder, whether that's virtual or physical way, to make a difference for the defense of our nation.
I appreciate that. I want you both to succeed, and am happy to do anything that I can to help along the way.
Thank you, sir. If I could, at the risk of 10 more seconds, simply add that I think that the JCDC is different in kind than what we have done before. This essentially is an agreement to collaborate, essentially to find dots, to co-discover threats that no one can find alone. That is different, authorized by the Congress, instantiated in law. We're now beginning to effect that.
Thank you both for your time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I must admit I continue to have a lack of clarity about cyber jurisdiction. I know you've been asked this question a few times, but the National Security Council exists to play a coordinating role on matters of national security, which increasingly includes cybersecurity. What is the central difference between the coordinating role of the National Cyber Director and the coordinating role of the National Security Advisor for cybersecurity? Earlier, in response to Congressmember Clark, you said the two roles are complementary, but I'm interested in knowing what makes them distinct, not complementary.
At the end of the day, if there's an event that requires the application of instruments of power outside of cyberspace, the various instruments kind of in the hands of government like intelligence or military or diplomacy, that's the traditional and sustained role of the National Security Council. My job is to ensure that the resources inside of cyberspace are prepared, complementary, and effected for the purpose intended, such that Chief Information Security Officers, CISA, Sector Risk Management Agencies, all of whom operate inside cyberspace, that they do the job that is required.
And I want to revisit a point that Congressmember LaTurna made. So there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and each sector has a sector risk management agency, and the role of CISA is to partner with those sector risk management agencies to secure critical infrastructure. Even though the TSA is the sector risk management agency for pipelines, the federal government designated the Department of Energy as the lead agency on response to the Colonial incident. Do you worry, as I do, that the designation of the Department of Energy as the lead agency perpetuates confusion about who exactly is in charge, about cyber jurisdiction?
Congressman, I think it's an excellent question. Neither Director Easterly or I are here at the time and therefore unable to illuminate that choice. I would say that from this day forward, from the moment we got here, we strongly believe that the playbook should be followed, that when we allocate roles and responsibilities to the question asked earlier, policy matters, it must be effected as intended, and therefore in the future we intend to exercise, allocate, and essentially respond according to those policies and laws.
And to be clear, who in the administration decides which agency takes the lead on a cyber incident response?
I think that we define that ahead of the time, such that that agency knows at the moment that that occurs that that's in fact what they should do. Again, within cyberspace, my responsibility is to ensure that those agencies understand those roles, they're prepared, and that they then execute those roles. As the on-the-field quarterback, Jen Easterly would then ensure that that is actually being effected.
Director Easterly, I appreciated your allusion earlier to Cobra Kai.
Thank you.
I'm a fan of the show. You said earlier there's a limit to what we can do in government, that there's no substitute for cyber hygiene from the private sector, and I agree with your assessment. It seems to me the breach of both Colonial Pipeline and GBS demonstrates that the laissez-faire approach to cybersecurity that the federal government has long taken has been a profound failure. A voluntary framework will only take you so far. There is no substitute for mandates. So I have a few questions. Should every owner and operator of critical infrastructure report major cyber incidents to the federal government? Yes or no?
Yes.
Should every owner and operator of critical infrastructure have a chief information security officer?
Yes.
Should every said owner and operator have multi-factor authentication?
Yes.
Should every owner and operator have password updates and software updates and third-party assessments?
Yes.
So if you agree that every owner and operator of critical infrastructure should adopt these cross-sector standards of cyber hygiene, as you described them, then when is the administration going to mandate them universally?
Well, we've begun a lot of that work with mandating it within the federal government, and that is the work that we are doing with the EO. All of those things are part of ongoing efforts, and that is signaling to our private sector partners who own that infrastructure. And, as you know, it's not owned by the federal government, but we are doing everything we can to ensure that we're signaling by leading by example and then by articulating the goals and standards that private infrastructure needs to implement to make themselves safe.
With respect, signaling is different from mandating. Like the only reason we have mandates for pipeline cybersecurity is Colonial Pipeline. And there's a sense in which I feel like we are reacting to events rather than governing. And I want to govern proactively.
Yeah, I think there is, I agree with you, bottom line. I think there is a role for ensuring that we are holding those who own and operate critical infrastructure accountable for ensuring that their systems and networks are secure and resilient. And I think you're starting to see some of that being implemented here by the government.
And I want to quickly squeeze in a question. I'm curious, Director Inglis, what is your opinion on General Nakasoni's cyber strategy of Defense Forward, and what impact, if any, has SolarWinds had on your opinion on that strategy?
I think the strategy, which has now been in place for 3.5 years, is an appropriate strategy. It follows on the heels of what we've done in other domains of interest. NATO is Defend Forward. The prepositioning of U.S. forces in South Korea is Defend Forward. It should be followed by the application of all instruments of power in a similar fashion, such that we have an early discernment of threats against us, an early action to engage those threats, such that we no longer wait on shore to receive those threats as they arrive in a distributed fashion.
Thank you very much. You see why he's vice chair of the committee, right? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Maria, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our ranking member and our witnesses for being here today. I actually want to follow up on what the subcommittee vice chair was asking about regarding that strategy, and specifically, there have been prior questions around the concept of deterrence, so I don't want to go back and rehash that ground. But I serve on both Homeland Security and Foreign Affairs, and a lot of these issues really, cybersecurity issues are at that nexus when it comes to foreign adversaries. And I know we've been working on a broader multilateral strategy on deterrence on the diplomatic side, but there are also unique vulnerabilities, or I should say unique protections within the U.S. In the way that our intelligence community is structured that I think are very well intended, but could have negative consequences. So I guess for both witnesses, are our foreign adversaries exploiting restrictions of our intelligence community by using US-based tech firms in order to launch attacks using virtual private servers?
I think we saw that pretty clearly in both SolarWinds as well as Microsoft Exchange. It's not a surprise. These adversaries are sophisticated. They are going to do everything they can. They're entrepreneurial. And so it's one of the reasons why we have put together the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative with those companies that have the visibility into domestic and global infrastructure that we don't want the intelligence community or the US government to have. These companies are able to provide this information in an anonymized way so that privacy is protected, but that we understand those vulnerabilities and then we can do something about it as rapidly as possible.
Would you say that would level out the benefit to our adversaries of using US-based platforms rather than using foreign platforms that may fall under a different set of guidelines for our IC?
Well, certainly it will help increase our visibility. As we know, we have better visibility overseas given some of our intel capabilities. But I think actors have shown themselves to try and take advantage of the blind spots. So we need to use creative ways to be able to create those dots, connect the dots to drive down risk at scale.
Are there legislative solutions that may help to further drive down that risk at scale and connect those dots further?
At this point in time, I really don't know. I don't think so. We need to get this model right and ensure that the information is shared in a way that is enabling and collaborative. But I will definitely come back to you, sir, if I think we need more authorities to instantiate this visibility that we need to defend the nation.
Thank you. I would welcome that conversation. I think, as you saw, we are passionately committed to doing what we can on talent recruitment and retention, on making sure that authorities are in place, on recognizing that this is a critical and pressing vulnerability of our country. So I think there is strong bipartisan support to do what we can to shore it up, but some of that may trip into other areas that I think we're happy to discuss online or offline. And then Director Inglis, in your testimony, you identified burden reallocation across the cyber ecosystem as a major key objective in order to take those unfair responsibilities off of the most vulnerable entities in cyberspace, such as individuals or small businesses, local governments that may have the least amount of resources and are least well equipped to deal with the magnitude of the threat. I guess just to put it briefly, how are you approaching this problem? Which stakeholders in this space do you feel should bear the largest share of responsibility for systemic cyber risk in the digital ecosystem?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that if you're an individual consumer of cyber services, far too often you have to provide for your own security in a way that a consumer of an automobile does not. Consumer of an automobile does not have to go out and negotiate for an airbag or anti-lock brakes. They're built in. So we need to start with that. The systems that we provide to our citizens, to users, have to actually be resilient, robust by design, at scale, commodity scale. Two, we need to make sure that those who would transgress, who would essentially hold them at risk all the same, that we understand who they are, how they operate, and that we find them and bring them to justice using all the instruments at our disposal. Legal means, financial sanctions, diplomacy. This is an international threat. We also need to make sure that in a time of extremis, contingency, or crisis, that the government provides resources as appropriate to help those individuals or businesses at that moment in time. All of those combined, I think, can make a determinative difference in the life, the progress of our individual citizens and businesses in using this, and increase confidence that those systems will be used for the purposes intended and not for transgressors.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the young lady from Texas for 5 minutes, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member for holding this important hearing. Congratulations to Director Easterly and Director Inglis for their ascending to important responsibilities. I believe that we are in an era that Dr. King wrote about as relates to civil rights. I think that era has raised its head again as it relates to civil rights, why we can't wait. And I think as it relates to the whole issue of cybersecurity, we're at a time and place in America and around the world that we cannot wait to be aggressive in addressing the questions that are going to come at us or the issues that we're going to confront rapidly. So, Director Easterly, you mentioned key stats from 2020 about attacks against America. In 2020 alone, there were more than 12,000 explosive-related incidents and more than a 70% increase in domestic bombings, according to the Department of Justice and U.S. Bomb Data Center. My question to you would be where CISA is in the role of prevention, but also aggressiveness as relates to the cyber engagement in that. And do you believe that the mindset of CISA should be aggressive in its protection and engagement with the entities around the nation, but more importantly, in its collaboration of the incidents that may come from outside of the United States?
Yes,
Director
ma'am.
Easterly?
It's a really important question. Thank you for asking it. You know, one thing that I didn't realize before I came to CISA was the power of our field force. We actually have over 500 folks, and based on the force structure analysis that we're doing, I suspect that number should grow. But these are our frontline defenders for both infrastructure and cyber, our cybersecurity advisors, our state coordinators, our protective security advisors that are there working to ensure that at the state and local level, at the small business level, at the critical infrastructure owner and operator level, that all of these individuals have the guidance, the information, the resources that they need to be able to protect themselves. And so I think those field forces are a very important part of what gives the magic to CISA to allow us to reduce risk to the nation's cyber and physical infrastructure.
Thank you, Director. Do you sense with the administration, and you're obviously a voice for the policy of the administration and actions senses the urgency of creative policies and the why we can't wait concept? Are you all creatively meeting and looking at ways to meet this aggression in addition to the able staff that comes under CISA?
Yes, ma'am. I believe we really have that sense of urgency, that sense of aggressiveness. Director Inglis and I are on the phone regularly. We are in contact with all of our partners across the federal government, and importantly, our partners at state and local and at private sector. I think everybody, you can't look at SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange and PulseSecure and Kaseya and JBS and Colonial Pipeline and get anything but a sense of urgency. And so we are powerfully motivated to defend the nation, and we are working at it every minute of every day.
Thank you. This question will go to both, but I'd like Director Inglis, and congratulations on your position. The pace of innovation and integration of new technologies are posing new challenges to cybersecurity. How are you, the administration, and working with CISA, integrating emerging threats and risks into the strategy for keeping security measures currently and focused on nimbleness? 5G, deep learning, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing advancements are just a few of the challenges. I've been steady on the issue of zero-day occurrences. Obviously, we're sort of advancing beyond that, but you understand the concept, which is when all things go awry. Director Inglis?
Thank you very much for that question, Congresswoman. I think that that's a very, very important dynamic. In the earlier question, you, I think, suggested that as opposed to simply responding to the transgressions, the initiatives of others who would hold us at risk, we need to establish our own initiative. We need to make sure that we reacquire a sense as to what we want this domain to do for us, not to us, and to achieve that. Technology, innovation, and best practices are a place where the United States and like-minded nations, but the United States in particular, can and must lead. The technologies you have addressed will play a critical role in that, and American innovation will play a critical role in understanding how those might make a difference. We need to do that, and therefore our investments need to be made accordingly, such that we build in resilience and robustness in this domain, then can achieve our aspirations, not our worst dreams.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamak, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of my colleagues for this very important discussion here today. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the work that I did as a student at the United States Naval War College was centered around cyber, so this topic is very exciting to me. And I would love to just use my time to talk about an initiative that is very near and dear to my heart. I would love for Director Inglis as well as Director Easterly to weigh in on the concept, logistics, challenges of potentially the creation of the next service academy of the United States Cyber Academy. We have worked to create a framework that would address some of our cyber workforce challenges. And I would love to hear from you about what something like that might look like that would be beneficial in meeting the needs from both a military standpoint, but also federal service, as well as the public-private partnership that we need with our private partners in this space, and how we might be able to better develop this and take advantage of the incredible talent that we have amongst our youth. And I think it's very exciting about next generation of cyber warriors that we can foster, educate, and deploy into this space through the creation of a next generation cyber academy a la West Point or the Naval Academy. And so I'm just going to start with Director Inglis first, and then Director Easterly, if you want to weigh in. I'm all ears.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for the question. You're probably aware that both of us are Service Academy graduates. I'm sure you meant to say the Air Force Academy first, but that being said, so we're both clearly aware of the value that a deep and sharp education in a discipline, a domain of interest holds. I think we're also aware that the proponency that's provided by the parent service is essential. And so if we were to define a service academy construct for cyber, we'd have to attend not simply to the work that would take place there that would inculcate the sense of what the technology, the doctrine, the practices would bring to bear. But we'd have to make sure that we attended to the generation of what's the mandate that should be taught and inculcated there, and who would then receive the proceeds from that. Now, in the case of cyber, you probably have many claimants on the graduate of those institutions such that they could then take that forward. You would then have to determine whether you're going to physically instantiate this in a single place or whether you broadly would separate or spread this across, many institutions that have already shown themselves able to do it. But I think your idea is very solid in so much as we need to dedicate time and attention to understanding the domain of cyberspace and the practices that best work inside of it, such that we can then avail ourselves of a cadre of people who have thought their way through this. I would tell you that cyber was declared a domain by the United States Department of Defense, not because the intention was to militarize it, but because it was sufficiently different. It was sufficiently new and novel that unless we study it and understand how it works and how it behaves, we will continue to be befuddled by it. I think that there are a number of institutions who've done yeoman's work in helping us get to that place, but there's further work to be done.
Yeah, I would only add first Beat Air Force, because it's that time of year. But also, I think it's incredibly important to explore creative solutions. I stood up the Army Cyber Battalion in 2008. Chris and I helped to build United States Cyber Command. I think there is a lot of creativity in the services that we can benefit from and some really good ideas out there. I am very proud to say that CISA is 42% veterans. Particularly proud to say that during Veterans Appreciation Month, but I think there's so much innovation and creativity in the military that we should figure out how we can create connectivity with that community and really amplify and emphasize it.
And I appreciate both of your comments, and as the sister to a career airman, I appreciate the nod and hat tip to the Air Force. And of course, one of the things that we've always struggled with, I believe, is that joint operability across the services. And then, of course, as the space has gotten bigger, how do we navigate that divide between federal service and the various intelligence agencies, as well as the military and then beyond? And so I think there's something really here, and you'll definitely be hearing from my office as we continue to build out the framework for this. And thank you again for your time and testimony today. Much appreciated. And with that, I yield back.
And we'll look forward to working with you on that.
Thank you.
Young lady yields back. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indulge me for a moment. Before we close, I just wanted to say thank you again for the great conversation and testimony today. I think it's very helpful. It's very encouraging to see everyone on the same page and trying to do the right thing here. As you may know, I issued in the past what I consider the 5 pillars of how we fight the cyber intrusions in this country. And the last one has to do with offensive capabilities or clapping back against bad guys. And I don't want to talk about it in this setting, but Director Inglis, I'm asking you specifically on behalf of my colleagues, many of whom have asked me this very question, if we could get a briefing in a secure setting on where we stand with respect to our offensive cyber capabilities so we can have a better understanding of the entire playing field. And obviously, I don't want to do it here, but I'm going to ask you a commitment to set something up soon to brief all of us on a committee.
We'll commit to doing that in the appropriate venue.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. One of the things I'd like to thank both witnesses for is your frankness and your willingness to address the known and unknown challenges. I think the Academy prepared both of you for the ability to make adjustments. Part of what the Vice Chair talked about is some of the going forward challenges that I think we'll have to meet. The fact that if we have a policy, we need to follow it. That's it. If not, change the policy. So what we saw with the Colonial Pipeline situation is a concern, but from both of you, we've heard a commitment to follow the policy and to try to get other partners to do likewise so that they understand it. That's important. The other part is, to the extent piggybacking on the ranking member's comments, some of the countries who give us the most heartburn, we have to continue to engage with. The public is somewhat befuddled that here we know nation states are doing things to us, but yet we are still engaging them on a daily basis. We go into space together, we're doing a lot of other things together, and sometimes we have to be clearer with our messaging so that the public is not confused. Lastly, this notion of workforce. It is an absolute concern. Congressman Green left the confines of his office to come to the end of the hearing because he's not going to let you get away without closing that deal today. But that's the point, that we're all interested in helping building the workforce because we're in this together, and to the extent that we can make that workforce look like America, the better off we are. So I join Mr. Green in that effort also. But just let me thank you for your testimony and the members for their excellent questions today. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds members that the committee